In the frozen winter of 1985, deep inside the Kremlin, Soviet economists were looking at numbers that terrified them. Oil prices were falling. Not slowly, not predictably, they were collapsing. And the Soviet Union, the superpower that had survived Hitler, that had built the bomb, that had put the first man in space, was about to discover a brutal truth that no amount of nuclear weapons could protect them from. You can't eat missiles. You can't heat homes with tanks. And you can't run an empire on ideology when the cash runs out. The story they don't teach you in school isn't about who won the Cold War through military might or superior values. It's about oil. It's about money. It's about a hidden economic war fought not with soldiers, but with barrels per day and Saudi production quotas. This is the story of how oil prices crushed the Soviet Empire. To understand how a superpower could be brought to its knees by a commodity price, you have to understand what the Soviet Union had become by the 1970s. It wasn't the industrial powerhouse Stalin had promised. It wasn't the workers' paradise Marx had imagined. It was an oil dealer with nuclear weapons. In 1970, the Soviet Union produced roughly 7 million barrels of oil per day. By 1980, that number had more than doubled to over 12 million barrels per day. The USSR became the world's largest oil producer, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. And unlike Saudi Arabia, which had to share its oil wealth with a small population, the Soviet Union had to feed, clothe, and control 280 million people across 11 time zones. Oil became the circulatory system of the entire communist bloc. It powered Soviet factories. It heated Soviet apartments. It fueled Soviet tanks. But most importantly, it generated hard currency. Because here's the thing about running a communist economy. You can print all the rubles you want, but rubles are worthless outside your borders. If you want to buy West German machinery, Japanese electronics, or American wheat, you need dollars. You need hard currency. And the only thing the Soviet Union produced that the West actually wanted to buy was oil and natural gas. The petrodollars flowed in. Moscow used them to import grain when harvest failed. They used them to buy consumer goods to keep the population from rioting. They used them to subsidize Eastern European satellite states, keeping the empire together with cheap energy. By 1980, oil and gas exports accounted for roughly 80% of Soviet hard currency earnings. Think about that dependency. 80%. The Soviet economy had become a one-trick pony, and that pony was standing on increasingly shaky ground. But in 1980, none of that looked like a problem. Because in 1980, oil was expensive. Very expensive. The 1973 Arab oil embargo had quadrupled prices overnight. The 1979 Iranian Revolution had sent them soaring again. By 1980, oil hit $120 per barrel in inflation-adjusted terms. For the Soviet Union, this was a golden age. The CIA estimated Soviet economic growth at 6% per year through the mid-1970s. Brezhnev's government was swimming in petrodollars. They built pipelines. They subsidized Cuba and Vietnam. They invaded Afghanistan thinking they could afford a long war of occupation. They were drunk on oil money. Soviet planners made a fatal assumption. They assumed high oil prices were the new normal. They built their entire budget around $100 per barrel oil. They committed to massive military spending. They promised subsidies to Eastern Europe. They guaranteed social programs at home. And they didn't save for a rainy day. Because in a command economy, there is no price signal telling you that you're living beyond your means. There's no bond market punishing you for deficits. There's just the Politburo deciding what the numbers should say. And the Politburo wanted the numbers to say everything was fine, but everything was not fine. While the Soviets were celebrating their oil wealth, something was happening in the West that would doom them. The 1970s oil shocks had taught Western economies a painful lesson. Dependency on Middle Eastern oil was a strategic weakness, so they adapted. Western governments invested heavily in energy efficiency. Cars became more fuel efficient. Buildings were better insulated. Industries switched to natural gas and coal where possible. At the same time, high oil prices made previously uneconomical oil fields profitable. North Sea oil came online. Alaska's Prudhoe Bay started producing. Mexico ramped up production. Global oil supply was increasing, and demand, at least in the West, was flattening. This is Econ 101. When supply goes up and demand stays flat, prices fall. But the Soviet Union wasn't paying attention to Econ 101. They were paying attention to Marxist-Leninist theory, which didn't have a chapter on global commodity markets. By 1981, the oil market was softening. Prices started to drift down. Soviet oil revenue started to decline. Not collapse, not yet. But the trajectory was ominous. And then a new player entered the game. A player who would accelerate the decline into a catastrophe. Ronald Reagan. When Reagan took office in January 1981, he had a simple goal: defeat the Soviet Union. Not through détente, not through arms control treaties, through economic warfare. Reagan's advisors understood something fundamental. The Soviet economy was fragile. It looked big on paper, second largest in the world. But strip away the propaganda, and you found an economy that couldn't feed its own people, couldn't produce quality consumer goods, and was held together by oil money. Cut off the oil money, and the whole structure would collapse. Reagan's CIA director, William Casey, commissioned studies on Soviet vulnerabilities. The conclusion was clear. Oil was the pressure point. If oil prices fell far enough, fast enough, the Soviet Union would face a fiscal crisis it couldn't solve. The question was, how do you crash oil prices? You don't have a dial in the Oval Office that controls the global oil market, but you do have influence with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, in the early 1980s, was the swing producer of OPEC. They had the spare capacity to flood the market with oil if they wanted to, but flooding the market would crash prices, and that would hurt Saudi revenue too. So why would they do it? This is where the story gets murky, where documented history ends and informed speculation begins. Michael Reagan, Ronald Reagan's son, claimed in a 2014 article that his father got the Saudis to flood the market with cheap oil as a deliberate strategy to bankrupt the USSR. The claim is plausible. Reagan and the Saudis had shared interests. Both wanted to contain Soviet expansion. Both feared Soviet influence in the Middle East. But here's the problem. There's no smoking gun. No declassified memo that says, "Dear King Fahd, please crash oil prices to destroy communism." What we do know is this. In 1985, Saudi Arabia abruptly changed its oil strategy. For years, the Saudis had been playing the role of OPEC's enforcer. When other OPEC members cheated on their production quotas and pumped extra oil to grab more revenue, Saudi Arabia cut its own production to stabilize prices. But by 1985, the Saudis were tired of being the only ones sacrificing market share. Other OPEC members, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Nigeria, were pumping flat out, ignoring quotas, and undercutting Saudi prices. Saudi market share had fallen from 30% to just 16% of global oil production. So in September 1985, Saudi Arabia made a decision. They would stop defending prices. They would flood the market. They would regain market share by any means necessary. Whether Reagan asked them to do it, or whether they did it for their own reasons, the result was the same. The oil market was about to collapse. The crash was swift and brutal. In November 1985, Saudi Arabia ramped up production. Within months, oil prices went into freefall. By March 1986, oil had dropped from $30 per barrel to $10 per barrel. It was the fastest collapse in oil prices in modern history. For consumers in the West, it was a windfall. Gas prices plummeted, inflation cooled, the American economy boomed. But in Moscow, it was an apocalypse. Imagine you're a Soviet economic planner. Your entire budget is built on oil at $25 to $30 per barrel. Suddenly, overnight, oil is $10. Your revenue just got cut by 2/3. You don't have a bond market to borrow from. You don't have a diversified economy to fall back on. You don't have a strategic reserve fund because you spent everything on missiles and subsidies. What do? The Soviet response was denial. Gorbachev, who had just taken power in March 1985, tried to maintain the illusion of strength. He continued military spending. He continued subsidizing Eastern Europe. He continued the war in Afghanistan. He couldn't admit weakness. Admitting weakness would invite rebellion. But the numbers didn't lie. By 1986, the Soviet Union was losing an estimated $20 billion per year in oil revenue. $20 billion, every single year. For context, that's roughly 5% of Soviet GDP vanishing into thin air. And it kept getting worse. Because the oil price crash didn't just cut revenue. It triggered a second, even more devastating crisis. Soviet oil production itself began to collapse. From 1988 to 1992, Soviet oil production fell by 30%. 30% in 4 years. Why? Because the Soviet oil industry had been overproducing for years, sacrificing long-term field health for short-term output. Soviet managers, under pressure to meet quotas, had pumped oil too aggressively. They flooded fields with water injection to boost pressure. They didn't invest in maintenance. They didn't invest in new exploration. It was classic command economy dysfunction. Meet this year's quota, don't worry about next year. And now, next year had arrived. Oil fields that had been producing at full capacity suddenly hit depletion. Production rates collapsed. The economic effect was catastrophic. Less oil meant less export revenue. Less export revenue meant fewer dollars. Fewer dollars meant they couldn't import grain, couldn't import machinery, couldn't import anything. The Soviet economy entered a death spiral. By 1989, grocery store shelves in Moscow were empty. Not because of war, not because of sanctions, because the government couldn't afford to buy food from abroad. The system that had promised abundance delivered famine. Gorbachev tried to reform his way out of the crisis. He launched glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring. He tried to introduce market mechanisms into the command economy. He tried to decentralize decision-making. He tried to allow limited private enterprise. But you can't reform your way out of bankruptcy. Reform takes time. Bankruptcy is immediate. The Soviet government was running out of money faster than Gorbachev could implement changes, and every reform he introduced made things worse in the short term. When you lift price controls in an economy with shortages, prices explode. When you allow private enterprise in a system built on state monopolies, the state enterprises collapse. Gorbachev was trying to perform open-heart surgery on a patient who was already bleeding out, and the patient knew it. By 1990, the satellite states were in full revolt. Poland had already broken free. Hungary was opening its borders. East Germany, the crown jewel of the Eastern Bloc, was collapsing, and the Soviet Union couldn't stop it. Why? Because stopping it would require force, tanks, troops, military occupation. And military occupation requires money. Money the Soviet Union didn't have. When East Germans tore down the Berlin Wall in November 1989, Gorbachev didn't send tanks. Not because he was a humanitarian, but because he couldn't afford to. The final blow came in August 1991. Hardliners in the Communist Party, desperate to save the system, launched a coup against Gorbachev. They seized control of Moscow. They declared martial law. They surrounded the Russian parliament building with tanks. For 3 days, it looked like the old Soviet system might claw its way back to power. But the coup failed. Why? Because the army refused to shoot. Why did the army refuse? Because the soldiers hadn't been paid. Their families were starving. Their officers knew the government was bankrupt. You can't run a dictatorship when you can't pay the soldiers. The coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned to power, but he was a ghost. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The next day, the Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve itself. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the world's first communist superpower collapsed, not because of military defeat, not because of ideology, but because it ran out of money. And it ran out of money because oil prices fell. The Soviet Union was gone, but the wreckage it left behind would reshape the world for decades. On January 1st, 1992, Russia, now an independent state for the first time since 1917, woke up to a new reality. The central planning system was gone, the subsidies were gone, the guaranteed employment was gone, and the economy was in free fall. Hyperinflation exploded. The ruble, which had been artificially pegged at roughly 1-to-1 with the dollar, collapsed. By 1994, it took 2,000 rubles to buy a single dollar. Savings were wiped out overnight. Pensions became worthless. Families that had scrimped and saved for decades under communism found themselves penniless. The stores that had been empty under Gorbachev were now full of imported Western goods that no one could afford to buy. Life expectancy in Russia fell by 5 years. Male life expectancy dropped to just 57 years, lower than in many developing countries. It was a demographic catastrophe, a social catastrophe, a national humiliation, and the Russian people remembered who had caused it. Not Gorbachev, not Yeltsin, not their own failed system. They remembered the West. They remembered that when their country was on its knees, the West didn't help. The West cheered. This bitterness, this sense of betrayal, would poison Russian politics for a generation. It would fuel the rise of a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, who would promise to restore Russian greatness. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to 1986, to the moment oil prices crashed. Because the story isn't just about what happened to the Soviet Union, it's about what happened to everyone who depended on oil revenue. The 1986 oil crash didn't just bankrupt Moscow. It devastated oil-producing economies around the world. Venezuela, which had built a generous welfare state on oil money, saw its economy collapse. The crisis would lead to political instability that continues to this day. Mexico, which had borrowed billions against future oil revenue, defaulted on its debt. The Mexican peso crisis of 1986 triggered a broader Latin American debt crisis. Nigeria, already struggling with corruption and mismanagement, saw government revenue evaporate. Infrastructure projects stopped. Public services collapsed. Even Texas, the heart of the American oil industry, was devastated. Thousands of oil workers lost their jobs. Banks that had lent to oil companies went bankrupt. Houston's real estate market crashed. The oil price collapse of 1986 was a financial neutron bomb. It left the physical infrastructure intact but killed the economic systems that depended on it. And the lesson was clear. Commodity dependence is a curse. Countries that tied their fate to a single commodity, whether oil, copper, or coffee, were vulnerable to price swings they couldn't control. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated by American ingenuity or by the superiority of capitalism. It was defeated by its failure to diversify. But here's the question that haunts historians. Was it deliberate? Did Reagan and the Saudis really conspire to crash oil prices as an act of economic warfare? Or did the Saudis simply make a business decision that happened to destroy America's greatest enemy? The evidence is mixed. On one hand, there's no smoking gun, no declassified memo saying crash oil prices to bankrupt the USSR. PolitiFact, investigating Michael Reagan's claim that his father orchestrated the Saudi production surge, rated it half true. They found evidence that Reagan encouraged the Saudis to increase production. There were meetings, there were discussions, but they found no proof of a formal agreement, no quid pro quo. The Saudis had their own reasons to flood the market. They were losing market share. They were angry at OPEC cheaters. They wanted to punish non-OPEC producers like Norway and Mexico who were eating into their profits. So maybe it was a happy accident. A business decision that happened to align with American strategic interests. But here's what we know for certain. Reagan's administration understood the Soviet Union's oil dependency. They studied it. They analyzed it. They knew it was a vulnerability. And when the Saudis made their move, the Reagan administration didn't try to stop them. They watched. They waited. And they let the Soviet Union bleed. Whether they pulled the trigger or simply handed the Saudis the gun, the result was the same. Economic warfare works. The fall of the Soviet Union ushered in a new era of American dominance. The unipolar moment, as it was called. The United States was the sole superpower, the global hegemon, the indispensable nation. American influence spread across the former Soviet bloc. NATO expanded eastward, absorbing Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. American companies rushed into Russia to buy up oil fields and natural resources at fire sale prices. Russia, humiliated and weakened, had no choice but to accept these terms. But the humiliation festered. And in 1999, a new leader emerged, Vladimir Putin. Putin was a product of the Soviet collapse. He had watched his country disintegrate. He had watched the oligarchs loot the state. He had watched Russia become a supplicant to the West. And he vowed it would never happen again. Putin's strategy was simple. Rebuild Russian power on the one thing Russia still had: oil and gas. When he took office, oil prices were still low, around $20 to $25 per barrel. But something was about to change. The 2000s would bring a new oil boom. China's economy was exploding. India was industrializing. Global demand for oil was surging. By 2008, oil hit $147 per barrel. And this time, Russia was ready. Putin had learned the lesson of the 1980s. He nationalized the oil industry, seizing control from the oligarchs. He created a sovereign wealth fund to save petrodollars for the future. He used oil and gas as geopolitical weapons, cutting off supplies to Ukraine and Eastern Europe when they defied Moscow. Russia was back. And it was using the same tool that had destroyed the Soviet Union oil to rebuild its empire. The wheel had turned full circle, but the story doesn't end there. Because the lesson of 1986 wasn't just learned by Russia. It was learned by every oil-producing nation on Earth. Saudi Arabia learned that flooding the market could destroy rivals, and they would use that weapon again. In 2014, when American shale oil production was booming, threatening Saudi market dominance, the Saudis made a decision. They flooded the market again. Oil prices crashed from $110 to $30 per barrel. The target this time wasn't the Soviet Union. It was American fracking companies that needed high oil prices to be profitable. Dozens of American shale companies went bankrupt. Thousands of oil workers lost their jobs. But the American companies adapted. They cut costs. They improved efficiency. They survived. And the lesson of 2014 was the same as 1986. Oil is a weapon, and the Saudis know how to use it. Today, as we sit in 2025, the global oil market is still a battlefield. Russia is still using oil and gas exports as leverage over Europe. Saudi Arabia is still managing production to control prices. The United States, Now the world's largest oil producer, thanks to shale, is less vulnerable than it was in the 1970s. But new vulnerabilities have emerged. China, the world's largest oil importer, is desperately trying to secure energy supplies to fuel its economy. Climate change policies are pushing for a transition away from fossil fuels, threatening to strand trillions of dollars in oil assets. And oil-producing nations are racing to extract as much wealth as possible before the world moves on. The geopolitics of oil are as dangerous today as they were in 1986, maybe more so. So what's the lesson? What do we learn from the story of how oil prices crushed an empire? First, economic power is real power. The Soviet Union had the world's largest army. It had nuclear weapons. It had a vast intelligence apparatus. But none of that could save it when the money ran out. Tanks don't run on ideology. Empires don't survive on willpower. They survive on cash flow. And when the cash flow stops, everything else collapses. Second, dependency is vulnerability. The Soviet Union made a fatal mistake. It bet everything on oil. When you tie your fate to a single commodity, you hand control of your destiny to forces you can't control. Global markets don't care about your 5-year plan. They don't care about your ideology. They only care about supply and demand. And when supply goes up and demand goes down, you're finished. Third, diversification is survival. The countries that survived the 1986 oil crash were the ones that had diversified economies. The United States produced oil, but it also made cars and computers and movies. Germany didn't have oil, but it made high-quality machinery. Japan didn't have oil, but it made electronics. The Soviet Union made oil and weapons and little else that anyone wanted. When the oil money stopped, there was nothing to fall back on. Fourth, soft power matters. The Soviet Union spent billions on propaganda. But when stores were empty and people were hungry, the propaganda stopped working. The American victory in the Cold War wasn't won by speeches about freedom. It was won by the fact that Americans had food on their shelves and cars in their driveways. Economic prosperity is the ultimate soft power. Fifth, history repeats. The same patterns play out again and again. Boom and bust. Overconfidence and collapse. Dependency and disaster. We saw it with the Soviet Union in 1986. We saw it with Venezuela in the 2010s when oil prices crashed and their socialist economy imploded. We're seeing it now with Russia, which is once again overly dependent on energy exports. The names change, the players change, but the mechanism is always the same. Commodity dependence is a trap, and eventually the trap closes. Here's the darker truth that haunts this story. The oil price collapse of 1986 was celebrated in the West as a triumph of free markets and strategic genius. But look at what it actually created. It destroyed the Soviet Union, yes, but it also created a generation of Russians who blame the West for their suffering. It gave rise to Putin's authoritarian regime, which has been actively undermining Western democracy for 2 decades. It left Russia bitter, paranoid, and determined to reclaim its lost empire. Was it worth it? The Cold War ended. The nuclear standoff de-escalated. The world became safer in some ways. But in other ways, the world became more dangerous. Because when you bankrupt a nuclear-armed superpower, you don't make it disappear. You make it angry, and anger has consequences. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 can be traced back, in part, to the humiliation of the 1990s. Putin's rhetoric is soaked in resentment about NATO expansion, Western interference, and the loss of Soviet glory. He's trying to restore what was taken when oil prices fell, and he's willing to burn the world to do it. So maybe the lesson isn't that economic warfare works. Maybe the lesson is that economic warfare has costs. Costs that aren't visible in the immediate aftermath. Costs that compound over decades. Costs that eventually come due. Let's zoom out one more time. The story of how oil prices crushed an empire is really a story about power. Who has it? Who loses it? And how it transfers from one empire to the next. In the 19th century, Britain was the superpower. Its empire was built on coal, steel, and industrial might. In the early 20th century, the United States rose by controlling oil, finance, and technology. In the late 20th century, the Soviet Union tried to compete by controlling oil and military force. It failed, because in the modern world, raw commodity production isn't enough. You need technology. You need innovation. You need flexible, dynamic economies that can adapt. The Soviet Union had none of that. It had oil fields and 5-year plans. And when the oil fields failed, the empire followed. Today, the global balance of power is shifting again. China is rising not because of oil, but because of manufacturing, technology, and strategic investment. The United States is still dominant, but its share of global GDP is shrinking. Russia is a declining power, clinging to oil and gas revenues while its population ages and its industries stagnate. Saudi Arabia is desperately trying to diversify its economy before oil becomes obsolete. And the whole world is watching the climate crisis, wondering if fossil fuels will even matter in 30 years. The next great power shift might not be decided by oil at all. It might be decided by whoever controls clean energy, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, or quantum computing. But the mechanism will be the same. Economic power will determine geopolitical power. Dependency will create vulnerability. And when the money runs out, empires will fall. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. So here's the final question. If oil prices could crush the Soviet Union, what could crush us? What is the modern equivalent of 1986? Is it a cyber attack that cripples our financial system? Is it a trade war that cuts off access to critical resources? Is it a debt crisis that bankrupts our government? Is it a climate catastrophe that makes entire regions uninhabitable? We don't know. We can't know. But we do know this. Dependency is vulnerability. And right now, the United States is dependent on Chinese manufacturing, Taiwanese semiconductors, imported rare earth minerals, a stable global trading system, and the dollar's reserve currency status. Any one of those could become our oil moment. The moment when an external force we can't control cuts off something we can't live without. And when that moment comes, all the military power in the world won't save us. Because you can't bomb your way out of an economic crisis. You can't drone strike a balance sheet. You can't invade a supply chain. The lesson of 1986 is clear. Empires don't fall because they lose wars. They fall because they run out of money. And in the modern world, running out of money is easier than you think. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The Soviet Union thought it was invincible. It had nuclear weapons. It had a vast army. It had an empire. But it didn't have economic resilience. And when oil prices fell, the empire fell with it. Don't make the same mistake, because the next empire to collapse might be closer than you think.